So I've got two books to review this time because they really go together. Um, so I'm going to start with the big one first and then the smaller one. So you see this, we're going to get to it in a minute. This big boy, the Weatherman's Guide to the Sun by Ben Davidson. I don't know if you are familiar with the suspicious observers. That's one word. The O in observers is actually a 0. It is a YouTube channel that has been around for, soon to be a decade. Run by Ben Davidson, and it started as a YouTube channel, and that became a launching point in a lot of his own scientific investigations and studies. And he's got a couple of websites that sort of all work together. And this was the first book that came out. You can see this is the second edition. It is actually now a textbook at multiple colleges and universities in their meteorology programs. So some people will maybe talk crap about Ben. And he's not a PhD in meteorology or astrophysics. The fact is, he's writing the things that those future PhDs are learning from. And I think that says enough. And he actually has a peer-reviewed paper that has been cited multiple times by other, scientists. He has a lot of scientists who follow his work because he's not inside the system. And so he is not financially beholden to any interests save his own and the members of the suspicious observers, the people who are, he has a website that has membership that, fair disclosure, I've been a member since he started it. I've been a subscriber to his channel since it really kicked off in 2011. I think it was 2011 because it was right after, or very soon after that, the massive earthquake in Japan that ended up with the tsunami that did Fukushima, right? That's why I'm pretty sure it was 2011 and like spring, summer of that time period. That's at least when I subscribed to him. And he's been doing some excellent work since. So this is the second edition of this book. I would not be surprised, and I should refer to it as a textbook. I would not be surprised if there is further editions in the future, as he keeps things up to date. So again, this is not a book that I'm recommending as a beautiful book. This is a book that you get for the information within it. So it is perfect bound, glued pages. So I would say don't be too rough with it, but it's also designed that it will have updates. So, anyway, so what this is, subject-wise, this book really discusses the interactions of solar activity and the Earth. Most of the focus is on solar activity and then weather and climate, but it also goes into how it affects the Earth crust movements, how space weather, how solar activity affects the crust of Earth, how it affects the atmosphere of Earth, and what is gleaned from that. So one thing I do appreciate, first of all, you can see this version is from 2018. There might be if you go on the website, and I will link the website, you can't get this on Amazon. He is publishing this entirely out of his own company. So, which good for him. Keeps him again less beholden to other interests. He doesn't have to rely on the goodwill of Bezos to get this thing out there, which is, you'll see why that's a good idea. But first of all, full color pictures all the way through, which I appreciate. And the information is very well organized. You can see here, this is the tagline actually from the YouTube show Eyes Open, No Fear. The YouTube, by the way, daily updates, literally every morning. There have been only a couple of times that he hasn't. He's taken, in 10 years, 1 weekend off, which was recent because his children are growing up and he needed to spend some time with his children. And when each of his children was born, he would miss that morning, which, I mean, legit, right? It's your kids. They only get born once. And he likes to make sure that he is attendant on their mother, which, good guy, huh? So our table of contents, and let me make sure you can see this. We have space weather, solar cycles, introduction to solar space weather, climate forcing, cycle and pattern modulation. It's electric, which is the electrical nature of the relationship between sun and earth, space weather, human health technology, solar triggered earthquakes, and location forecasting. So, of the 2 books, I'm going over this one first because I think even though they're both independent from each other and you can read them independently from each other, I think having this information as a prerequisite, if you understand this, what comes in the next book will make more sense. It'll make sense anyway, or it ought to, but you'll be more familiar with certain concepts that I think really help if you already have them sort of in your mental cosmology. And specifically, items that are addressed in this book that are good to know or good to be familiar with before you read the other book is things like the heliospheric current sheet, which is this. Having this as a concept, and the sun being at the center of this, and then this current sheet, this wave being pushed and flowing out through the solar system, that is a concept you really want to have before you go into the next book. Also, CMEs and CME impacts, how they affect the Earth, cosmic rays, known solar cycles, the effect of solar cycles on climate and weather, the effect of solar weather on human health and technology, the relationship between solar activity and earthquakes, to the point that you can even predict major earthquakes based on solar activity. And at the end of this textbook, he actually describes how to do that. Before Twitter kicked him off, he was regularly posting maps with timing and location predictions. And he had an amazingly good score. He would keep track of the statistics. And I want to say his accuracy rate, it was, in terms of location timing, he had very strict standards, right? Like saying, oh, there's going to be an earthquake on the Ring of Fire. Well, duh. I mean, there's always earthquakes and volcanic eruptions on the Ring of Fire. That's why it's called the Ring of Fire. So he really had to, narrow it down, give very specific parameters of location and timing, sort of the sort of thing that it would have to be usable, that if based on this data, you sent out a warning that it would be more useful than not. And he, even with those strict standards, he had a really good rate of so you can see he has right, so this is, they have a Billy Elverton who actually has a lab in Georgia. He you get images here of shooting, electrical current at stone with water or other things, and how does that work? Which has a lot to do with how which has a lot to do with how solar activity creates or triggers earthquakes. And you can see this is the references, right? And you just have multiple pages of this. So this is a very well referenced. There's a quiz in the back. Remember, this is basically used as a textbook, a glossary. There is not an index. However, again, because this information is so well organized, that if you're looking something up, you can go to the table of contents and figure out where it is. So we know that earthquakes and sort of your tectonic physics, this is all in your final chapter. This is weather. You have the effect on weather. You have your health risks, and he spells that out very clearly. All of these graphics either belong to the suspicious observers, or they are publicly available because they come from government sources. So there's really very little in terms of imagery. So for instance, this is an artist rendering that belongs to the suspicious observers because they paid for that, and they use that graphic quite a bit. But the rest is very, it's NASA, right? This is publicly available information that he is compiling here. One of the reasons that he got kicked off of Twitter is that this information really undercuts the narrative regarding anthropomorphic causes for climate change. Now, and he stresses this every time he talks about it. He's not pro-pollution, right? He absolutely agrees we need to clean up the pollution. We need to stop mistreating the earth. But we also need to stop mistreating humans. So this is, if you want the some actual state-of-the-art science that is comprehensible by a layperson, because this is all, it's very close to home in terms of, solar system. It's scalable. So if you understand just the basics of how electricity works, you will actually understand, I would say, everything that's being discussed in this book. There's not fluff. Again, this is so well organized. He gets right to it. He is constantly citing his sources, which then you can go back in the notes to find the full citation, so you can go read the papers yourself. So yeah, I would say, they have an earthquake prediction center, right? I remember 10 years ago that was a pipe dream. But the fact is, they put out an app, okay? There's an app for this. And there have been some others that have come out since with their own methods. But from what I recall, the suspicious observers, Ben Davidson started it, came out with it. And since then, he's got people at NOAA and NASA, a lot of them for reasons of keeping their jobs. They cannot be public, but they have given him heads up on papers that are coming out or things that NASA is going to say. So yeah, and you can see him act on those warnings before those things actually come out. So interesting. I would recommend subscribing to the channel. I'll leave a link below. Daily updates. When you get those, if you're not familiar, there's multiple documentaries in the playlists. Go to those first to catch you up. But this book is an excellent way of just sort of setting the stage. This is really the state of the art, the state of science, what we really think is happening with the sun, with the solar system, how what happens on the sun affects what happens on Earth. Now, with that as your basis, we have this book, which, yes, looks very ominous, and it is. This book is about the rebirth, as it says, the next end of the world, the rebirth of catastrophism. The rebirth of catastrophism. And he goes into, with this textbook as your sort of foundation. He first talks about, let me see, oh gosh, it's tiny. It's tiny. Let's see if we can zoom in a bit. Here we go. All right. So he talks about, here's your first chapter is a very brief overview of what even is this book about. And the idea that there is some sort of recurring disaster that happens in our ancient history again and again. And for a long time, people assumed that it was, of course, there's some sort of cataclysm that happens on a something of a regular basis, but we don't know the timing, we don't know what it is. And then in the mid-20th centuries, that model was dismissed wholesale, and we got the theory of incremental slow change on the planet. And part of that was the CIA absolutely interfered, just like they interfered with music and art, and our understanding of history. They also screwed around with our science. And we know this because we have the documentation of it. It was declassified. And it was very quietly declassified. This stuff was out there for quite a while before anyone picked up on it. But golly gee, once they did. And so we have, Hapgood, who is the guy, if you ever saw 2012 and you have the guy in the trailer he's kind of a nutcase, but he's actually also kind of right about everything. But he gives his little introduction to, the idea of the catastrophe, and he references Charles Hapgood and Einstein. The problem was Hapgood is a red herring. Hapgood was a real red herring. Hapgood is known now to have been an employee of the CIA. And all he had to do was put a couple of not true things into the final version of his book that was published after Einstein died. And it was a fatal flaw introduced, and it took down all of catastrophism. The thing is, at the same time, They knew that that was a flaw. It was deliberate. They knew what was real, and that the truth behind that flaw could not be dismissed like that flaw was. So that whole story is told in chapter 2. And then they go into like the actual report thing that was written by Chan Thomas, and what was really more recently released and declassified was the Adam and Eve story. From that, and that talks about, basically the idea is that our sun is a long period recurrent micronova. And in fact, they're finding more and more that a lot of stars are recurrent novas. And there's some thought that perhaps most, if not all, stars are recurrent novas, but they're not supernovas. These are not the sun, the star explodes and wipes out the entire system, and there's nothing left except maybe a white dwarf or a black hole. That's not a micro nova is the star, the sun, is shedding its outer shell. There's an outer shell of dust and detritus that finally just poofs off and expands. And that this happens on a cyclic, recurrent basis. Now, as you can imagine, if you are a wee tiny planet orbiting a star that sheds its outer shell, it's going to be a bad day, right? It's going to be a little rough. That is the theory here, is that that is what that recurrent catastrophe is. And that it happens on cycles, and that there are even half cycle events, because this all works into, it describes how it all works into. So chapter 4 is about magnetic excursions, which is when the magnetic poles wander. Usually we think of the magnetic poles as being in the vicinity, not exactly where the geographic poles are, but in the vicinity thereof. But the fact is the North Pole still is, for a given definition of in the vicinity, but the South Pole is not anymore. The South Magnetic Pole is not on Antarctica at all. It's totally shut off, and it's up into the Indian Ocean now. So this chapter talks about magnetic excursions. And then we have chapter 5, all about the micronova. How does this work? What information do we have? The galactic it talks about the galactic current sheet. This is why understanding the heliospheric current sheet is such a big idea, because if you understand that, the galactic current sheet is just a bigger version of the helio current sheet. So, and then talking about the next cycle, where we think we are, what's going on, what is the estimated timeline, what can we do? So this is it's kind of an ominous read, I'm not going to lie. But it's, as with the other book, it's a lot of good information, very quickly, no fluff. Here's what it is, here's what's going on, here's what needs to be considered. And here's, again, the science on it. I'm trying to remember if he has... this is, because this is not a textbook, the notes are not as extensive. A lot of what they would be citing is things that they cite in their main textbook. Here we go. So our notes are, the footnotes are in the page, not at the end of the book. So yeah, this does have notes so that you can look at, find further information. You'll see there are the pretty pictures, not as many. Well, yeah, some, I'd say. Oh, and look, you can see the same, where did it go? that graphic I showed you in the textbook, they use it again here because it's the exact same idea, just at a different scale. And that's a lot of what's being discussed here is this is all known science that scales. Now, why, in the first review, when I was talking about the stack of books that I have to review, and I was talking about how being aware of what's going on in other fields, not keeping your focus just to the books in the field that you're focusing on is important, is this. When we talk about, there's a lot of talk in esoteric literature or in psychology tube, you're talking about archetypes and disaster, and because so much of modern thought presupposes the incremental universe, where in the universe change happens at a slow rate, nothing major ever happens, right? I mean, sometimes a star will explode, but that's only after it's reached the end of its long, long millions of years. We don't have to worry about that now. And so all of the legends that we have, all the myths that we have that say, hey, these things happen, it is a tendency for people to say, oh, well, that's an archetype. You know, that human progress was steady, that we don't have previous civilizations. There was no worldwide flood. That it's been a linear progression from evolving as an amoeba to a fish to some sort of mammal, to some sort of other mammal, to primates, to humans. But because of that, a lot of thought in the esoteric realm, a lot of thought in general presupposes that universe and presupposes that model. But, and so all of our understandings of the Bible, ancient myths, again, we all say, oh, well, because we know that there's no way you can get a flood through the whole world. There's no way, the earth doesn't just stop moving and the sun doesn't stand still in the sky. Or conversely, same time period myths on the other side of the planet, you don't have, nights that last for 3 days. We presume that it's talking about something else. It's not talking about what it's literally talking about. And yes, you can get some great insight in psychology. You can get some great esoteric insight from that. But you tend to dismiss things. Things in legend. If people have other ideas, you say, oh, when the Bible's talking about the giants of the old day and the Nephilim, well, I mean, that's metaphoric. That's not real. There were no giants. Because there was no actual, the flood was a local Mediterranean event. It wasn't worldwide. Despite not only myths existing worldwide of such a flood, but actual geological evidence for such a flood. If, however, you are aware that roughly every 12,000 years, there is a massive change that affects the whole planet. That there is big things that happen, and that rightfully the ancient people pointed to the sun and said, that's who done it. Well, that changes things. It doesn't erase any of the insights that were given to psychology or any other study. But now you can say, 12,000 years, and we have this idea that roughly 10,000 years, 10,000 BC, something changed. Something was different. Our myths say so now. Göbekli Tepe was from roughly that time period and looks to have been buried quite deliberately. You have a lot of megalithic structures that sort of point to that time period of, 10, 11,000 BC. Well, now, it's possible that there were giants and that they were wiped out by a flood. It's possible that there were a lot of things. It's possible that there were multiple. It is possible that there were multiple civilizations that arose and were wiped out that had high technology before this one. And with that possibility, you're less likely to dismiss literal interpretations of certain things like giants, like floods. And I think that, well, I'm going to mention that I think at some point in the Peter Gray book I have to review. But I would say this is a reason why keeping your eye on not just the mainstream science that the nightly news tells you about, but what's really going on, the fights actually happening in the papers, the science that is disapproved of by the mainstream. See what's going on there, because you'll find very interesting developments, things very contra to what you would think to find. So that's why I keep track of what's going on in this world. I highly recommend the work of the Suspicious Observers. It's not just Ben. He's sort of the front guy, and I would say a leader, such as there is. He does a lot of the work. He puts out the morning updates every day, and he's the guy doing most of the documentaries. So again, I will put a link to his YouTube channel and the big websites that he runs, and also to the place, his store, where you can get both of these books. You can get them in PDF form. You can order them in physical form. He's mostly concerned with just getting this information out there and not giving more money to like Jeff Bezos, right? Like this is how he feeds his family, folks. So that's these books. I do recommend them. I do recommend, if you're going to get this one, get both of them. Because this is the underlying science, and this is the underlying cosmology that will make this a lot. You can understand this without it, but it's a lot easier. It's a lot less. There's a lot less for you to wrap your mind around if you're already familiar with what's in the textbook. All right, that's all for this review. See you soon.